Box. Today and for the next 6 weeks we're going to be looking at the British music scene. 10 years ago we could probably have covered the subject in half an hour. But now the record business is no longer a simple matter of rich superstars on richer labels against tired hopefuls playing the circuit and waiting for that break. The scene is more open, complex and diversified than at any time in its 30-year history. But what's brought this about? Was it just the explosion of punk rock that made music available, free and fun once again? Today, in an especially extended show, we're going to look at some of the events that have influenced and revolutionised pop music over the last 30 years. And hold on to your hats because we'll be travelling at just under a year a minute.
20th century. 20th century.
The Bell Stars on stage at Dingwalls, playing a mixture of rock and reggae. A few years ago, a band like this wouldn't have fitted into most people's idea of pop music. Now they're tipped for success.
Take your lessons from the Indians, the national side they fought, look where they ended up. Integration, social changes, different customs, they stopped us from getting in a rut. Have we forgotten of the past? From one tribe, one species and one caste. Some nations fight to keep their dignity. There's persistence whoever they may be. Don't be brave as an Indian, they fought and they died. Share your land with your brother man. Get your national pride. Don't be brave as an Indian. They fought and they died. Share your land with your brother man. Get your national pride. Don't be brave as an Indian. They fought and they died. Share your land with your brother man. Get your national pride!
In the last 5 years, the British pop scene has altered radically. The charts reflect this change. They contain more new British bands than at any time in the last 15 years. And these aren't just bands playing one style of music. To understand today's top 10, you need to know more than the names of some new groups. You almost have to master a new language. Deep Fisher, an heavy metal group. Ellipsoid, a new romantic singer. Clifton, now Clifton's a futurist. The Hep Dogs, a new rockabilly band. Swang Control, your British funk group. The Kippers, a two-tone band. And the Conscious Brothers, a British reggae band.
Musical style? Well, it's recycling so fast at the moment. I was talking to a rock photographer last night, one of the most well-known ones in this country. She was saying that, she goes away for a weekend. It's the whole new thing springs up.
At my son's school, they all got very quickly into the two-tone thing. They're all rude boys, and then they dropped that. He went into the sort of soul boy thing, which is like a staging post for going on to something else. They went through the Adam and the Ants thing in a couple of months, and very quickly, and now he personally is a Spandau Ballet fan. Britain's new pop scene began in 1976. The starting point and the impetus for much that followed was punk.
The Pistols are helping kids to think. That's why everybody's scared, because there's some kids that are actually thinking. The Pistols reflect life as it is on the council flats. not some fantasy world that most rock artists create. Yes, they will destroy it, but it won't be mindless destruction. What they destroy will be replaced by a more honest creation. The likes of Led Zeppelin, Queen and the Pink Floyd need to be chucked in the classical music section. Those and bands like them are composers, musicians and artists. They've got to make way for real people, and the Sex Pistols are the first of them.
The attitude was a sort of rebellion against everything that had been going on for the previous 10 years. There was a whole new set of 18-year-old kids, you know, that hadn't grown up with the Rolling Stones or Pink Floyd, didn't know about that, and they wanted their own set of heroes and groups, etc. And so they made them. And it also tied in with fashion. It all came together at the same time. It was a really sort of organic thing, I think.
But how new was punk and what followed it? What really has changed about pop music today? From Johnny Rotten to Johnny Ray, the connection might not seem obvious, but crooners like him were a vital ingredient in the first revolution in rock music 30 years ago.
If your sweetheart sends a letter...
This kind of bland melody appealing to young and old alike dominated the charts in the early 1950s. Ingredient number 2 was a new generation of American teenagers with money to spend on new mass-produced record players and new plastic 45s, hunting for music they could call their own. They found it in different isolated local music scenes. In New Orleans, jazz. In Memphis, country. And in Chicago, rhythm and blues. Ingredient number 3, small independent record labels that grew up to produce the music young people couldn't get elsewhere. They started selling just in their own hometowns, but were so successful that they began to spread the local music further afield. Jazz, blues and country began to meet and fuse together.
I'm gonna need your parachute when I get through walking these blues, when I get back to New Orleans.
The big thing for rock in the 50s really was that at that time the business was in the hands of a few big companies, and rock and roll and rhythm and blues, which it was a sort of a connection to, both came out with on little labels. And so it was like as much a business revolution as it was a music revolution.
Well, it's one for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, now go, cat, go. And ingredient number 4, a singer who did more than just fuse the music together into the new sound of rock and roll. He made it teenage music by outraging everyone over 25 with his clothes, his style and his act. He was thought so obscene that the first time he appeared on TV, they would only shoot him from the waist up. Overnight, he was a hit.
Well, you can do anything but take me over my blue suede shoes. Let's go, cat!
If you look back at, say, Elvis Presley, there had been 78 RPM breakable records around that up until that time, and they introduced 45 unbreakable little records, and suddenly here comes this new artist to sell loads of them, and historically it looks as if that was a plan, but I don't think it was.
A golden age of rock and roll began. Dozens of other young people, encouraged by Elvis's success, began to form bands, playing different combinations of their own raw local music. With the music went a whole teenage culture. Young people in Britain were so obsessed with rock and roll that even aging rock and rollers like Bill Haley got a hysterical reception when they came here.
Well, Saturday night and I just got paid. All about the money, don't try to save. Let's go for have a time on Saturday night, baby. I feel fine, I'm all right. It's time to jive on the old 6-5.
But it couldn't last. Gradually, the big acts got cleaned up as rock and roll was turned into a product with mass appeal. The stage was set for the next revolution.
He called for his pipe and he called for his bowl and he called for his gypsy. Everybody do the rock. Everybody do the roll.
Ingredient number 2, another new generation of teenagers, this time British, turning their back on this music. They listened to specialist American imports. Or the new black sounds from Tamla, Atlantic and Phil Spector. Ingredient number 3, not record labels this time, but small clubs. In these clubs, young British groups tried out new fusions of the music they'd been listening to. Ingredient number 4, these same groups became symbols of teenage rebellion the way Elvis had been. In London, the Rolling Stones and the Who.
Just because we get around.
And in Liverpool, the Beatles. These 3 groups were to dominate the charts worldwide. The beat revolution was underway. Once again, there was a golden age as dozens of new groups sprang up to play their own versions of this new music. But again, within a few years, the beat revolution burnt out. This time, the music split. The big stars of the late 60s devoted themselves to huge concerts or to recording complicated albums. The singles field was left to the watered-down, cleaned-up versions of the teen idols the Beatles had been. The Bay City Rollers were the 70s version of what Johnny Ray had been. A new generation of teenagers were fed up with it.
It's got nothing to do with them anymore when like Rod Stewart gets up there and starts like going on with his string orchestra, you know what I mean? It's not what you feel like. So you've got to have some music what you feel like, otherwise you go balmy, don't you?
The ingredients of this new revolution were even more varied than had gone before. First, the club scene had undergone a revival as teenagers turned to live music or specialist imports to get the kind of sound they couldn't find in mainstream pop. Up north, they were obsessed with soul. Down south, it was disco, long before Saturday Night Fever.
This is the underground of the 70s, late 70s, it's disco. Totally misunderstood by the media. They think that disco is something to do with Baccara and Donna Summer, and it's not. It's a very tight little scene, and they're always 6 months ahead of the rest of the country when it comes to picking out sounds, dancing to records.
At the same time, a new generation of musicians like Ian Dury were playing in a circuit of pubs around London, creating what was known as pub rock. And small independent record labels sprang up to record this music that the big companies wouldn't touch.
That was an area where the record companies weren't at all interested in the music that the great population of London seemed to be very interested in, because they didn't feel it was commercial outside of England. They felt it was pub rock, and that was a drawback in itself. A couple of bands like Dr. Feelgood and Dux Deluxe, I think, were a little bit forerunners of punk to a sense, because both of them were pretty hairy to begin with, and they were very tough, and there was a couple more bands like that, I think. And we met a lot of people that we thought were great, but there was no outlet for them in the recording point of view. So when we started Stiff, they're the people we approached. So from our point of view, yeah, there was a lot to do.
The stage was set for another musical upheaval. But the style that was to be its spearhead was strongly influenced not only by British rock styles with a club following, like heavy metal and pub rock, but also by New York bands like the Velvet Underground and Iggy Pop.
I am the passenger, and I ride through the city outside. I see the stars come out of the sky, yeah, the bright and hollow sky. You know, it looks so good tonight.
Pistols were the band that pulled together the elements that were to reclaim music for teenagers. They created a blaze of publicity for the new music, punk. It was the start of a year when punk seemed to turn rock music inside out. With the music went fashions calculated to shock and offend, sold by Sex, a shop owned by Malcolm McLaren, the Sex Pistols manager. Punk lyrics, featuring boredom and unemployment, were right for a teenage audience at a time when recession was biting and unemployment rising.
Career opportunity, the one that never knock. Every job I offer used to keep you up the dark. Career opportunity, the one that never knock. We don't know what's the rock and roll, wow. We don't know what's the getting show, wow. We don't know what's the Jenny Jones, so we don't like it, fall down now. We don't know what's the rock and roll, wow. We don't know what's the getting show, wow. We don't know what's the Jenny Jones, so we don't like it, fall down now.
People say they have to study music for years, and kids are frightened.
Rubbish. That's nonsense. I can't play a damn thing and I'm doing all right. Thank you very much. I mean, like, all music is just a collection of noises, and if you can remember how to make the same noise twice, that's music.
Punk went further than just encouraging other young people to form bands the way previous rock revolutions had done. It set out deliberately to demystify the rock business. Anyone could form a band or make a record. In the wake of the Pistols' success, punk fans began forming their own bands. Though the actual number of teenagers who ever became punks was probably very small, punk's style and attitude soon influenced theatre, TV and films.
Well, the punk scene was very strong at that time. It was late 1976, early 77, and musically in London there was a huge turmoil going on. The punk thing was happening. A lot of people gave up overnight. A lot of people were very inspired by it and went on to do other things. And I think that we were pretty much inspired by the sort of energy that was happening then. And it was a very positive force for us.
But punk only lasted 1 year. Unlike rock and roll in the 50s and modern beat in the 60s, punk never became a best-selling style of music. In 1977, the year of punk, no record by a punk band was among the 50 top-selling singles. The main reason for this was that punk worked much better live than it did on records. So you must have been asked a million times, but what does it feel like to have been Johnny Rotten and the Sex Pistols now? Is it a memory? Is it
I don't know. I mean, ask the imitators how they feel. To me, it didn't mean too much. I just thought it was a joke.
Could you look around and see yourself ending up, say, like the Clash have, like on this endless spiral?
God only knows. I hope not.
Were you the only one with ambition then? Because the other geezers in it, I mean, they seem to be lost. How much ambition have you got?
Who are you talking about?
Well, Stephen Paul, obviously not Sid.
I don't know. Listen, I mean, in the Pistols it was difficult because they were all into, like, the regular rock and roll format, verse, chorus, and I just couldn't write things like that.
It worked for the time though, didn't it?
It worked, yeah, for a bit. And then Malcolm began to take it all just too serious.
Joe, everyone thinks of you as well as being the musical force behind the Sex Pistols.
I had nothing to do with the music of that band. I just wrote the words.
You never wanted to write any of the music?
No. Not the way they were doing it. My ideas were totally different.
Another school of...
Well, I mean, it was a chance for me, right, so I took it. because I quite like the way I write.
Was it a laugh at the beginning?
I just had to set off a duff old Chuck Berry reruns, but that's... I don't know, it got me a foot in the door, so I took it.
Was it a laugh at the beginning? Did you think it'd amount to anything?
I never thought it would get anywhere, never in a million years. It just was like a real good piece of fun.
On records, the acceptable face of punk was the so-called new wave groups like Graham Parker and the Rumour, Ian Dury and Elvis Costello. These were the bands that had their roots in the pub rock scene. They had more musical sophistication than punk, and on record, this counted.
She gave a little flirt, gave herself a little cuddle, but there's no place here, bottom and a skirt waddle. Capital punishment, she slashed his model. They call her Natasha when she looks like Elsie. I don't want to go to Chelsea. Oh no, it does not move there, even though I've seen the movie. I don't want to check your pulse. I don't want nobody else. I don't want to go to Chelsea. Everybody's got new orders. Be a nice girl, kiss the waters. Now the teacher is away. All the kids begin to play. Men come screaming, dressed in white coats. Make you very gently by the foot. One's named Gus, one's named...
Other groups had to look outside punk for their musical influences. And it wasn't just the musical weakness of punk, but the financial weakness of the record industry that helped to fragment the music scene. In previous music revolutions, the record industry had been expanding and in a strong position to influence popular taste towards a single profitable area. Now record sales were falling, and major record companies seized on every new musical fashion, hoping that it would get them out of their difficulties. And on top of that, young people in Britain were by the 1980s part of a multiracial society with many more cultural and musical influences on them. One of these influences was reggae. It had already built up a devoted following by the mid-70s, but the music had all come from Jamaica. Punk gave young British blacks the confidence to start forming bands. Groups like Steel Pulse began to make it into the charts. It was to be the same thing with funk. Again, in Britain there was a devoted following with its own clubs and record shops and with its own exotic style of dress. Again, the music was played by black musicians and had previously been imported, this time from America. Now, as with reggae, a new generation of British-born blacks decided in the wake of punk to form their own bands. Lynx followed the newly established route to success, recording at first on their own label and breaking into the charts on the strength of a cult following.
Everybody seems to have had their chance, like punk rock has had their chance at media highlights. Reggae had its chance at getting the media. And now it's heavy metal is having its chance at getting the media, and at last it seems that jazz funk is starting to have its chance. So it's our chance to rise and shine. Not us as a group, but us as a movement.
The mere fact of being 30 years on from the first rock revolution has also helped to make today's music scene more fragmented. There are now 30 years of different music and fashions for bands in search of a style to choose from. Some have revived music that had never really gone away, like heavy metal. Bands like Iron Maiden found chart success by adding the speed and energy of punk to the 3 chords of Judas Priest. Their fans not only bought their records, they also copied the heavy metal headbangers' tribal look. Others revived cults that everyone had thought were dead and gone. In 1979, Carnaby Street filled up once again with mods. The mod revival was based around The Jam, a band who'd formed at the same time as the punk groups. In the West Midlands, the mod revival took a completely different form. There, bands like the Specials turned out a new version of ska, the Jamaican music of the 60s that had been adopted by the original mods in this country. Like Mod in London, Two Tone combined music and fashion. I think the interesting thing about Two Tone was that the music and the fashion did run very closely, and at one point I thought that the fashion was actually going ahead of the music, that people who are into the mod thing and then the rude boy thing were actually looking around for groups, you know, they were moving a bit faster than the music could. Apart from that, the most interesting thing was that was a music and a fashion that reached to a very, very young age, much younger than anything ever before, so that you've got kids of sort of 10 years old who could buy the clothes and get into the music, and that I think is one of the most significant things that's happened in the last couple of years. And finally, technology began helping to change the music scene as well. Synthesizers have been used by musicians since the late 60s. By the mid-70s, they were being used both in experimental music and disco. Bands like Ultravox succeeded in combining these 2 strands into records which found commercial success. But by the late 70s, synthesizers didn't cost much more than a good guitar. A much wider range of groups could afford to experiment with them, like the Human League from Sheffield.
I think because guitars are so old-fashioned now. Whenever a band uses a guitar, you always know what it's going to sound like before they're finished. We've always used them for drums. We can never afford to pay a drummer either, so we get our drums out of it, hi-hats. If we want a horn section, we do one on something like this.
How hard are they to play?
They're dead easy, really. I mean, it's usually with a synthesizer you can get it to do something for you that you don't have to be manually good at all. That was why we turned to them in the first place, because no one could learn how to do the guitars either, because we'd all tried. My brother's a great guitarist, and he tried to teach me. It just hurts your hand. So we use these things, and you can press a switch on them, and they'll do things for about 10 minutes. It's quite interesting. If you've got a tape recorder, you can put it down, put something next to it, and it'll sound all right.
For some reason, though, people think it's kind of cheating, don't they? If you just get it out of a machine.
I don't know why. I think it's better. I think if there's anything that's ever been original about our group, it's the fact that we hadn't got a clue about music, so we just go for the sound of it. And we don't have the background like a guitarist in learning the guitar. He knows how to play a guitar, so it sounds like a guitarist. We don't know how to do that, so it sounds completely different.
So in a way, it cuts out all the years of training and whatever?
Oh yeah, that's why we went for it, because we were all very, very lazy indeed.
But though a synthesizer may be cheap and easy to play, it has one big disadvantage. Watching one being played isn't exactly energising. And this has driven bands who use synthesizers to rely heavily on manufactured visual excitement. David Bowie had been important throughout the 70s, both as a musical innovator and as a source of fashion. His fans slavishly copied his every change of style.
It's quite amazing because there's all 7 characters that I've created are out there somewhere. I see a man who fell to earth and a Ziggy Stardust and a Thin White Duke and at the moment a lot of sailors' hats and things. That's incredibly endearing.
London, Bowie evenings started at clubs like Blitz, where the emphasis was as much on fashion as on music. And from this background, new synthesizer bands like Spandau Ballet emerged. Spandau Ballet's fans came to concerts to gaze at each other as much as at the band. And from this cult following, the band broke through to much wider success. So reggae, new wave, funk, two-tone, heavy metal and electronic dance music all find places in the charts together, and new cults keep coming. In the past 6 months, yet another trend. The revival of 50s rockabilly has swept into the charts.
Well, they need me when a big Saturday night. I had my hair part-time, but baby just looks so right. Well, pick up a 10, gotta have your way too. Mama, I don't know what I got from you, but that's alright, 'cause we're looking as cool as can be.
Now the music scene is turning over so fast that it's not even a matter of separate new cults anymore. New bands are drawing on the whole range of musical styles available from reggae to heavy metal and blending them together in their own individual sound. Adam and the Ents have found success this year by blending a variety of music and fashion styles. And this pattern had already been set by the Police. For them it was the key to widespread success.
Roxanne, you don't have to put on the red light. Those days are over. You don't have to sell your body to the night. Roxanne.
How do I see it? Well, I can only sort of paraphrase everything that everybody's written about us, really. I think it's a blending of a lot of sort of late 70s, early 80s elements. And I think, you know, we did take punk and reggae and put it together, but the thing is that we all have other backgrounds. I grew up listening to R&B and soul, and so did Sting, and Stuart listened to various sorts of music, and I think all those things in subtle ways influence what you eventually become as a musician.
You don't have to put on the red light. You don't have to put on the red light. Roxanne.
Anyway, to get back to the earlier point you were making about the melting pot, I think that is very relevant. In this country now, which is such a small country and is so condensed with so many different nationalities, so many things happening, that I think that's going to be really interesting. I mean, not only black people with reggae music, but so many different Asian strains are coming in. I think it's going to be really interesting in the next 5 years what happens.
And so punk did give birth to something new and different. Because punk never dominated the scene musically in the way that rock and beat did, there's now more novelty and variety in British music than there's ever been before. This means that no one singer or band is likely to break through and create yet another revolution in the way that happened in the 50s and the 60s. But it also means that a new band like the Bill Stars, with their blend of rock and reggae, flowers and feathers, have as good a chance of success as anyone else today. Do you think a band like yourselves could have happened, say, 5 years ago?
Yeah, anytime you like. Even in the 18th century, why not?
Is there a Bill Stars image?
No, we don't try and I don't think we try and project one.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And lively.
Surely,
and
it goes with our music, as you say, like dance music. You've pictured us now, you know. Dance music, dance band, dance clothes. Why not?
Is there any pressure on you to be a certain type of group?
Oh no, none at all. We are what we are, and if the people like us, then that's it. If they don't, then bye-bye. You're not making any future plans. You're not studying for a mark of the man. You're not thinking about settling down. From now on, I'll be running around. I want no more letters from my mum and dad. No more running from Jack to lad. No more money for to save the world. From now on, I'm an independent girl. Just having a good time. Don't need a car, I'm a pretty far. Don't need a house, I got a hole in my heart. Don't need money with a smile on my face. And when I want to, I'll go any place. I want no more luggage from my mum and dad. No more bragging from Jack to lad. No more money but to save the world. From now on, I'm an independent girl. Just wanna be a movie star. Specialist of being old grandma. I love a boy if I got you. I love the life I live, I ain't got nothing to lose. I want no more nagging from my mom and dad. No more bragging from Jack to lad. No more money but to save the world. From now on I'm an independent girl. Just having a good time. 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 Do I wind it up?
Fine, do you think it's a good career for a young man to get into, of being in a group?
No, I could do without the competition.